one of the most ancient forms of literature in the world. It predates the novel by 2,000 years. You can point to the wanderings of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, to the wanderings of the Pandava brothers in the Mahabharata, to the Epic of Gilgamesh, as some of the most ancient examples of literature in the world, which revolve around the idea of a journey. You take the journey as the backbone and you string onto that a series of stories. Travel writing has changed century by century. The early medieval travelers like Marco Polo, and the Arab geographers like Ibn Jubayr, the Chinese and Japanese pilgrims like Byung-Sang and Li Po. This is a genre that transcends ethnicity and nationality. It appears in all cultures. Travel writing is something very universal. And it, unlike the novel, which tends to spread from Europe outwards, is something which has appeared independently in many different cultures, in many different centuries. Today, the question is often asked whether there's any role left for travel writing today. Obviously, no one needs to go to a travel book to answer the kind of questions which readers of Marco Polo were looking for. You wouldn't go to try and find out the things you buy on a spice route. You don't go to a travel book for empirical information. There's many better sources for getting straightforward, hard facts than the writings of a subjective travel writer passing briefly through a landscape. The question is also asked about the validity of the eye of an outsider, particularly in post-colonial times, about the eye of a white outsider looking at a non-European society. But I think the best answer to all these questions lie, A, in the strength of the travel writing which is out there at the moment, and B, in the popularity of the genre. People do love reading travel books. It is a very universal, very basic form of literary sustenance. So what we propose to do over the next hour, next 50 minutes, is for all of us to read very briefly from our very different books. We're going to go from left to right. If each reader introduces their book, gives a little idea of what it's about, and then reads for about 5 minutes, and then I can open up the discussion and hand it over to you guys towards the end. Okay, so, Samanth, do you want to open up?
Thanks, Willie. My book, Following Fish, Travels Around the Indian Coast, came out about, I guess now it's a year and a half, in May 2010. The conceit of the book is not so much to talk about fish, but to use fish to talk about people who live on the coast, fishing communities, cultures and societies that spring up around fish. And to sort of exemplify William's point about the pliancy and the flexibility of travel writing and sort of the myriad other genres it can incorporate, I thought it might be interesting to start off with a section of my book which is not travel writing in the strictest sense. It goes on to become travel writing, but it's sort of it's a section of memoir from my own life. And this chapter is set in Hyderabad in Andhra Pradesh, and it talks about the asthma medication that is delivered every year inside a live fish. But I start off, as I said, with a section of memoir. For many years, even well into his sightless 80s, my paternal grandfather used to practice an art that must be called faith healing, but only because it was predicated on his faith and because it healed. Nobody in my family knows exactly where or how he absorbed this art, and only my father can even begin to explain how it works. But the Tamil verb for his actions, mandrikardu, sounded so much like the name of the Indrajal comics hero Mandrake the Magician, that at some point in my childhood, I conflated my grandfather's art with Mandrake's magic. Whenever my grandfather came to stay with us, I'd have the opportunity to linger and watch him at work. He would sit opposite the patient, both on low wooden planks, he bare-chested and buzzing with health, the patient querulous but always eager to believe. My grandfather would shut his eyes and collapse into a little trance, his lips whispering noiselessly. Then he would, with his index finger, trace a host of mysterious prayers into a brass platter of sacred ash placed in front of him. The patient, meanwhile, would sit on in silence. A few further minutes into the process, my grandfather's moving finger would move no more. He would palm a few inches of the ash and, filling his cheeks, blow it all over the patient. Then he would draw a thumbprint of ash in a streak across the patient's forehead, demand an open mouth, and drop in a peck of ash. What remained on the salver would be folded into neat sachets made of old newspapers to be consumed in installments over the next week or 10 days, as rigorously as antibiotics or any other more orthodox medication. My grandfather's energized ash was most effective, it was said, against poisonous insect bites and jaundice. One family story goes thus. When he was still living in New Delhi working as a civil servant, my grandfather had, as a visitor, one of the most eminent physicists of his time. His scientific temper would, of course, not allow him to actually trust in such mumbo-jumbo, but his scientific temper was overruled by his wife's temper, which urged him in no uncertain terms to get his particularly severe jaundice treated by Ramachandran Mama. So the scientist arrives, bursting with bad bile and disbelief. My grandfather begins, his usual methods augmented for jaundice only by a shallow bowl of water set near his patient. As he traced and whispered, he would move his hand from the patient to the bowl, back to the patient, and then to the bowl. Slowly, the water turned a sickly yellow-green. "What's that?" the scientist barked. "That's the excess bilirubin in you," he was told. "That can't be," he shot back, and when the treatment ended, he whisked the bowl off with him to be tested at lab. Being a family story, the climax is naturally dramatic. The scientist came back the next day or the day after, fell at my grandfather's feet, and begged to be forgiven for his skepticism. The lab had found traces of bile in the water. More importantly, he was feeling remarkably better already, his jaundice slowly inching its way towards the exit. I never had jaundice, and I don't think any insects beyond the routine household menagerie of mosquitoes and ants ever bit me. But in my fierce attacks of childhood asthma, my grandfather's art finally met its match. Time and time again, I would sit in front of him, wheezing and heaving, crumpled from lack of breath, while he concentrated ever harder and traced ever more purposefully. In my school bag, as regularly present as my lunch, as a lunch at a company, would be a neat newspaper sachet of sacred ash to be taken during breaks. I came to know its taste the way a caffeine addict knows his espresso. But it did no good. An attack would wane, but the next dusty place or the next change of season or the next drink of cold water would set it flaring again. Secretly, and the fable of the skeptical scientist notwithstanding, I always wondered if it was because I just didn't believe hard enough. If, in faith healing, it was as important for the healed to have faith as for the healer.
I'm going to read from a book, Chains of Heaven, about a journey I took in Ethiopia, in the highlands of Ethiopia, about 4 or 5 years ago now. One of the great strengths of the travel book, I think, is its arbitrariness. It's apparently like a journey. It has a sort of the chance encounters that one has, and gradually they accumulate into a narrative or a larger point or a historical view of somewhere. But as a traveller and as a writer and as a reader, you have the experience of wandering around through all this sort of maze of human experience and cultural diversity, and gradually some sense of meaning and pattern comes out of it in narrative. And that's why, one of the reasons, and there are several others, why the travel narrative itself is so successful. I've got two very, very short readings, the first of which is a chance encounter. I walked through the highlands typically with a couple of mules and the mule men with us. And although it was a dry season, we got hit by a rainstorm and had to take shelter. And this is an account of what happened when we took shelter. The north of Ethiopia, the province of Tigray, was very badly affected during the civil war, and during. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me just go back to the beginning. Philip Marsden, and I will be reading from my book about Ethiopia. Okay. Sorry, I missed my clap. I'm hugely encouraged by that. So yes, the Tigray province of northern Ethiopia, badly affected during the period of the Derg. That was Colonel Mengistu's regime, and a lot of the resistance came from this particular province in the north of Ethiopia. And we've just stepped off the road out of the rain and come across a woman there. Mengistu was rattling a pan of coffee beans over the heat of a brazier. She was sitting on a stool. She glanced at us as we stumbled in, and then resumed her rattling. The brazier was made up from an old tin of cooking oil donated by the World Food Programme. 4 children sat on a clay ledge. A baby was a low mound on Mengistu's back. The rain continued. We drank coffee. As it grew dark, Mengistu stood to light the lamps. We drank more coffee. The room contained her entire life: a bottle of shampoo on a shelf, a few clothes, school books, a bed each side of a crooked column of goba wood. On the wall was taped a government poster, divided into 2 sections. One was a cartoon picture of a line of sturdy-looking maize, the other a smiling family with 2 sturdy-looking children. The slogan beneath read, "Family planning and street planting give strong results." Mengistu had no land. Her husband was in prison. He burnt something in his work. She supported herself and her 5 children by serving coffee and beer, tala, to the passers-by. The beauty of her face was somehow frozen, but when she smiled, it revealed a sudden and undefeated joy. Once, when Mengistu was very young, a man came to her village. He had a soft voice and spoke like a priest. He told them all that they were ruled by bad people. They'd always been ruled by bad people. And what the bad people most wanted in this world was for everyone else to stay poor. The old rulers were bad people and had been driven out. That was Haile Selassie's regime. Had been driven out, but the Derg, the new regime, who replaced them, were also bad. The most important thing to understand, he said, was this: the bad ones can be bad ones because the good ones do not fight. So Mengistu became a fighter. She went to the rebel stronghold in Shiraro. She began training. She met a man there, but they couldn't be together because it was forbidden. Under the rebel rules, you weren't allowed any physical or sexual contact with anyone while you were fighting. Mengistu told herself that when they had defeated the enemy, then they would marry. But one day the Derg came in planes and bombed the camp, and the man was killed. The attack made everyone want to fight even more, but Mengistu did not want to fight. She now believed that fighting just made everyone unhappy. She stopped her military training. She helped the movement with food distribution, but when the famine came, she fled to the Sudan. She met another man there and married him. She then went to Asmara, divorced, married again, and had 5 children. It was only 3 months now since her husband had been sent to prison. We spent the night in a small shed in her yard. I woke to the sound of the morning cockcrows, goat bleats and donkey brays, then the muttering of Solomon at his morning prayers, and the slow rattle of Mengistu's coffee pan over the brazier. And just very briefly, this is an account of one of the other attractions to me, apart from trying to unravel the political situation and recent history in the area, was the very ancient church. Ethiopia was the 2nd country in the world to become Christian and retains a very, very strong and colourful and remote monastic tradition. And a lot of the monasteries are set in remote places, on islands and lakes, or in this case, at the top of a cliff. And I'd heard something about this monastery and the difficulties about getting there, but I had no idea of what was to come. This is what it entailed, reaching the monastery of Abba Salama. Reading my notes now brings it all back. The writing is rushed and angular, the pages smudged with dust and sweat. The monk led us down a ladder, across a narrow saddle of rock to the main cliff. A ledge ran around one side of the saddle. There were no handholds, but the ledge was a couple of feet wide. What made it perilous? What made you place each foot so carefully and press your hand to the cliff on one side was an awareness of the vast space, hundreds of feet down on the other side. After 30 yards, there was a gap in the rock above and a short scramble up a ladder. You were now in a narrow chimney, a cliff behind and a cliff in front, and on either side a bird's eye view of the gorge far below. The wind funneled between the rocks. A ladder rose in front of you, and you craned your neck and looked up. It was actually two ladders welded together, made from rust-brown iron. It began at a slight angle to the vertical, but flexed until it was flush and sheer with the rock face. The monk was talking about the bottle of water he dropped here the other day. It bounced on the rock and did not roll on over the precipice. It did not even break, because it was holy water. You did not want to hear that. You didn't want to hear about things falling. But you began to climb, one rung at a time. There was no sign of the waist rope that people had mentioned. And you were now halfway up the ladder, and it was straight up and down. It was secured at the top with a wire and had a couple of inches play in it. It came away from the rock as you climbed, but that was okay because it had dug itself into the soft sandstone, and you needed to pull it out from the cliff to get a toehold or a handhold. You looked along the cliff face, and a couple of ravens hung in the wind. You envied them their wings. You did not want to look up. You did not want to look down. You examined the bloodless white of your fingers as they gripped the ladder. Reaching these places, you thought, these cliff-top monasteries, is an entire rite in itself. One rung at a time, and then the ladder stopped. The summit was still some way up, still out of sight, and to one side was the chain. It was 3 or 4 arms' length away, and even by leaning you couldn't get close to it. You had now to leave the ladder, and the wind was pressing at your ears, and you had to traverse the cliff face and make a grab for the chain. You stepped away from the firm hold of the ladder, pressed your fingers into cracks in the rock. You reached the chain and gripped it. But then you had to remove your hands one at a time because they were so sweaty you were slipping down the chain. You leaned back and pulled yourself up the last 20 feet of cliff. And that was the worst part, because this last section was overhanging. Up at the top was Abba Minata Mariam Gabri Mikhail. Ah, he said, that chain gives me so much pleasure. His face wore a look of ageless calm. Look at you, he said, sweating so much. When I climb, I just put my faith in God.
Well, strangely enough, I've also chosen to read a monk. This is a reading from my book, From the Holy Mountain, which is the only one of my books which has no connection at all with South Asia. It's a journey I undertook in 1994, following the route of a Byzantine monk from the 6th century called John Moskos. And it is a journey through the Eastern Christian communities, the Copts, the Maronites, the Syriani, the Armenians, all these scattered ancient churches, dwindling now in the lands that used to be the birthplace of Christianity. That used to be Christendom. Long before Christianity spread to Europe or to America, the Middle East was the center of Christianity. And at the Council of Nicaea, where the words of the Christian creed were hammered out in a conference in a town just over the Bosphorus from Istanbul, there were only 2 bishops from Western Europe. There were, however, 3 bishops from India and 4 from Iran, just as a measure of how far the geography of Christianity has moved westwards. And in some places, the monasteries that John Moskos had visited in the 6th century had been ruins for nearly 1,000 years, or more than 1,000 years in some cases. But in many cases, the monasteries were still there. And the monks were still praying on the same Byzantine mosaics, worshipping the same icons, singing their daily office in the language of 6th century Byzantium, a strange thread linking the world that I saw with the world of the world of John Moskos. But perhaps the strongest link was the extraordinary mindset of the monks, who lived in a world every bit as full of superstition and the miraculous as their early medieval forebears. And I took particular shine to the guest master in a monastery called Marsden on the West Bank, called Father Theophanes, who was used to be a policeman from Athens and gave up his job and became a monk in the Middle East. "Look at it," said Father Theophanes, the monastery's tall, gaunt guest master, waving a hand at the dark, rocky gorge beneath us. "There it is, the valley of doom, the valley of dreadful judgment." Below us, the monastic buildings of Marsden fell away in a ripple of chapels, cells, and oratories, each successive layer hanging like a wasp nest, from a ledge on the rock face. Opposite the top of the cliff wall had turned an almost unnatural shade of red in the last of the evening light. The rock was pitted with caves, each formerly the cell of a Byzantine monk. All were now deserted. "It's very beautiful," I said. "Beautiful?" said Father Theophanes, rustling his robes in horror. "Beautiful? See down there in the bottom, the river. Nowadays it's just sewage from Jerusalem. But on Judgment Day, that is where the river of blood is going to flow. It's going to be full of Freemasons, whores and heretics, Protestant schismatics, Jews and Catholics. More ouzo, please." The monk poured a small thimbleful of spirit into a glass. When I gulped it down, he continued with his apocalypse. "At the head of the damned will be a troop composed of all the popes of Rome, followed by their deputies, the vice-presidents of the Freemasons." Are you saying the Pope is a Freemason? A Freemason, he's the president of the Freemasons, everyone knows this. Each morning he worships the devil in the form of a naked woman with the head of a goat. "Actually," I said, "I'm a Catholic." "Then," said Father Theophanes, "unless you convert to orthodoxy, you too will follow your Pope down that valley through the scorching fire. We will watch you from this balcony," he added. "But, of course, by then it'll be too late to save you." I smiled, but Father Theophanes was in full swing and clearly in no mood for joking. "No one can truly know what that day will be like," he said. "But some of our Orthodox fathers have had visions. Fire, fire that will never end. Terrible, terrible fire will come from the throne of Christ, just like it does on the icons. The saints, those who are to be saved, in other words, the Orthodox Church, will be separated from the elect. The damned will be pushed and prodded by devils through the fire, down the valley of Josaphat, past here, exactly the route those Israeli hikers took an hour ago, down, down to the mouth of hell." "Is that nearby?" I said. "Certainly," said Father Theophanes, stroking his beard. "The mouth of hell will open up near the Dead Sea." "Is that in the Bible?" "Of course," said Father Theophanes. "Everything that I'm telling you is true." Anyway, I stayed with this guy for a week. And it was only at the very end, on my last day, that I plucked up the courage to ask him, "Father Theophanes, I just don't understand. Why are you so obsessed with Freemasons?" "Because," he said, they are the legions of the Antichrist, the stormtroopers of the whore of Babylon." But I thought, these days Freemasons just had coffee mornings and bridge drives and that sort of thing. "Bridge drives?" said Father Theophanes, pronouncing the word as if it was some sort of satanic ritual. "Probably this bridge evening also. But their main activity is to worship the devil. There are many steps," he said, nodding knowingly. "But the final step is to meet with the devil and have homosexual relations with him. After this, he makes you Pope, or sometimes President of the United States." "President of the Certainly," he said, "this has been proved. All the presidents of the United States have been Freemasons, except Kennedy. And you know what happened to him."
How do you follow that now? So I'm not accused of not making myself clear from down there. My name is Tim Butcher, and this is my crude product placement. books not about the devil. They're chasing the devil. What a great allusion. Chasing the Devil is one book, Blood River is the other, both about journeys I made in Africa. There's a large pile of them unsold in that tent over there. If you could help me rectify that, I'd be most grateful. I agree with Willie's introduction, which is that travel writing started in a certain form, and it has evolved, it has refined, and I would argue in a strange way that just about every book that you see here, every book you see in that bookshop, every spine you have at home is a travel book. It takes you on a journey of escape, whether it's a piece of fiction, a piece of poetry, even an icon on your Kindle, that devil machine that us authors worry about so much. They are all about travel. It's about escapism. It's about taking you out of your world to another place. The journey I want to take you on is to a place a little bit far removed from India. We're off to West Africa. We're going to go to Liberia, a small country, a very troubled country. A country that's been full of war and turbulence these last 20, 30 years. I made a journey there 2 years ago. I walked for 600 kilometers through the bush there on a journey that was pioneered not by a Byzantine monk, but by someone even more peculiar, Graham Greene, the whiskey-sozzled English author, aged 30, who went off to Liberia and found himself. He had an amazing journey, a journey of discovery. He learned in Africa to love life again, and everything of Greene's writing really flows from that. I followed that because I wanted to use his writings as a snapshot to compare and contrast this modern turbulent country. So off we are, we're in Liberia, we're in the bush, West Africa, and I'm fascinated by the authority figure in this community, the authority figure, the figure who keeps an animist society together. It's the person who can talk to the spirits. And there in West Africa, they have a very powerful name in Liberia. The person, the shaman figure, the witch doctor figure, is known as the devil. So I'm going to go off and have an encounter in Liberia with the devil. And the only other character to be mentioned in this thing is a man called Johnson, who's my guide, a fantastic Liberian man with a great sense of humor. He came from the Kissi tribe, and I met him on the first day of this trip. He took one look at me and said, I shall call you Fallow, he said. Fallow, which is a very neutral word in Kissi, and I put it in the back of my head, and I thought, I wonder what that meant. So I spent the whole that first day, about 20 kilometers of walking, flogging my way through the rainforest. I was exhausted. He was sort of dancing ahead, gambling. I was getting more and more blistered. At the end of the day, up a long hill, my lungs hanging out of my ears, I said, Johnson, tell me, what does fallow mean? Does it mean mate or chum? Or is it deferential? Does it mean skipper or boss or something? He said, fallow, it means old man. If you are to complete this journey, you'll need an old man stick. Anyway, so we're off with Johnson. We're in the bush. And I'm interested in these figures, the figures that glue society together, the devil. We walked slowly and in silence. Twilight was approaching, and with it a looming sense of menace. All the buildings fronting the road bore damage from war and neglect. On one wall, some wartime graffiti remained, announcing in large black letters the one-time presence of young Colonel Black Gina, and promising no die, no rest, no blood spots in Lofa. After sundown, the jungle has the effect of hurrying on the arrival of darkness, with the tree cover making the shadows seem inkier and faster at massing. It was just at that point, when I was struggling to see into the distance, that the sound of the devil dance reached us. First I heard drums and rattles, then voices chanting a chorus. Out of the gloom came a small group of people, huddled together as if for safety, and in front of them, a swirling, shaking blur. Cloaked in raffia, the devil was capped by an ancient-looking headpiece carved from a single piece of jet black wood. There was a shrunken, human-like head with carp lips and oversized ears on an extended, twisted alien neck sticking out high from the base plate of the headpiece. It was difficult to tell quite how large the being was. But below this, one moment it crouched, motionless, close to the ground, the head no higher than my waist, and the grass tresses of its coat hanging limply. And then, with an explosion of dust and screeching, it span and shook. The mask now high above my head, the raffia startled with energy. The musicians followed the performance closely. As the devil slowed and shrank, so their music faded. But when he started to spin and gyrate, so their chanting and drumming grew in throbbing, repetitive turns. All eyes were focused on the performance of the costumed figure as the dust rose and the darkness gathered. As well as the devil's musical entourage, there was another attendant, a young man who fussed over the raffia coating, combing it flat in between spins to make sure nothing of what was underneath could be seen. Everyone in Liberia knows that under every devil costume is the body of a man, but quite what has happened to that body when taking on the costume, what spiritual power has been assumed, remains an important and powerful mystery. The young man I saw flattening the raffia tendrils was simply protecting the spiritual illusion, doing something that the Greens, Graham Greene travelled with his cousin, there are two of them, the Greens had also seen in the same place, Bolohun, when they saw their first dancing devil. Graham Greene's description would have worked perfectly for what I saw 74 years later. Greene wrote the devil's interpreter squatted beside him carrying a brush, with which, when the devil moved, he kept his skirts carefully smoothed down lest a foot or arm should show. The energy of the dance was powerful. The setting amidst the darkness and the war damage had a hint of menace, but I was struck by the lack of threat in the devil's display. A few young children stared wide-eyed at his dance, but on the faces of the adults there were smiles and looks of mild amusement. A dancing performance by the devil such as this was, above all, entertainment. The devil was playing the role more of minstrel than magician, an entertainer rather than an enchanter. It was a very different performance from that when the same devil appears at initiation schools out in the bush. After his routine, when the devil had disappeared into the night, the musicians gathered around me expectantly, and Johnson, my guide, whispered something about me offering to pay. I proffered a bundle of grubby Liberian dollar notes, and the Koma, the young man responsible for keeping the raffia costume in order, clasped both his hands around mine, thanked me solemnly. His hands were cold. As we walked back through the unlit hovels of Bolohun, I listened closely to Johnson's thoughts. You see here, the devil plays an important role in all our village societies here in Liberia. Sometimes he can be bad, but most times he's a person who entertains us, who helps us at important times, such as funerals and village ceremonies with dances, such as the one you have seen. The devil you saw dancing here is the good devil. I only hope you never meet the bad one. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Katie Hickman, and I'm going to be reading from a book that's quite old now. I think it was published in 1992. It's called Travels with a Circus. Alas and alack, you won't be able to find it in the bookshop, but you can get it on Amazon. I'll just put that in right now. I think one of the... It's the story of a year that I spent traveling in Mexico with this Mexican circus. And the reason that I did that is for the very good one that I think all my fellow travel writers here will have had the same problem. One of the problems that you face as a travel writer is that you're always an outsider looking in on somewhere, and you're always a foreigner passing through a foreign country, or very often. And so I hit upon the idea of joining a circus because my idea was that a circus is like a traveling village, and that if I could go and join such a community, I would be able to get to know the people in this travelling village very well, get to know them really as people, not just chance encounters, strangers who I passed on the road. But at the same time, the village would be moving, so I would be able to travel all around Mexico, and I would be able to see the country as well. Now, this idea worked very well on paper when I was sitting back in London, that when I actually got to Mexico and I found my circus and was allowed to join and told that I could become part of this community, what happened was that the whole of the rest of Mexico just completely disappeared into the middle distance. The circus itself was such an incredibly absorbing place to be, and the people who I met were so fascinating in themselves that I really could have been traveling anywhere at all. I could have been literally anywhere. I could have been in my own country for the amount that I really saw of it. And so I had, in order to see Mexico itself, after a few months I had to leave the circus and make certain forays into the countryside. And the passage that I'm going to read you, which is quite a short one, took place on one of these forays. It was in a state called Michoacan in central Mexico. I'm going to have real problems trying to get this right and be able to see the page at the same time, but here we go. In a small wood in the state of Michoacan, for a few months each year, 35 million monarch butterflies come to rest. I went there very early in the morning. At first, the wood was just like any other wood. There were many butterflies around. It was true. All monarchs, with their distinctive bright orange wings, but in nothing like the numbers that we've been led to expect. We'd been walking up through the wood for some time when we came to a grove of about 20 pine trees on the hillside. Unlike the clean, spare branches and trunks of the other trees in the wood, these trees were suffering from some kind of fungal growth. A strange brown, cobwebby substance hung from their branches and stuck to the sides of the trunks. In places the growth was so thick that the branches, even the thickest, strongest ones, sagged beneath their weight. Apart from a few orange butterflies, languidly flitting in the watery morning light, the wood was utterly silent and still. I sat down to rest on the stump of an old tree trunk. It had been quite cold that morning, but now the sun was rising steadily, piercing through the thick cover of the trees. I began to take off my jacket, and as I looked up, I noticed something stirring in the trees above me. As the sunlight warmed the branches of the trees, the lichen, or whatever it was, had started to move. At first, this was no more than the faintest pulse. But as the sun increased in strength, it became a quiver, a trembling, and finally an extraordinary, fully fledged flapping. The growth was not leaves or lichen or old man's beard after all, but millions upon millions of sleeping butterflies. Awakened by the light, they gradually disengaged themselves from the branches where they had massed together a foot or more deep until the whole wood was full of them. There were so many that the air crackled with the sound, like distant electricity. Occasionally, as we watched, with a faint plop, a pair of butterflies, locked in lovers' combat, would drop onto the ground beside us, writhing together in the soft dust. But this was only the beginning. We'd been standing for several minutes like this when the real miracle happened. Above us, there was a sudden, rushing noise like the wind through the trees. When we looked up, we saw that all at once, in one spectacular golden shoal, one of the trees was releasing its burden of butterflies towards us. From a single point on one of the branches, at first a river, then a torrent, then a very waterfall of butterflies was tumbling towards us. In a shimmering, tinkling king's ransom of shining copper, they poured down the gully, until there were so many it became impossible for the eye to focus. The air around them dissolved, as it does when heat rises, until there were so many creatures on the wing that the sky was black. And then they were upon us. Closing my eyes at the center of the maelstrom, I felt the wind of 100,000 wings brush my cheeks, felt them touch my cheeks, eyelids, lips, hair. I was blinded, deafened, struck dumb by butterflies. For a few moments, the entire physical world was blotted out. I could not move, could not think. I was entirely made of butterflies, for they were all that existed. A soft golden galaxy of spinning proboscis, antennae and fronds of copper silk. And for a long while I stood with my eyes shut, my arms outstretched, laughing and crying out in ecstasy. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm going to be reading from, my name is Akash Kapur. I'm going to be reading from my forthcoming book, India Becoming, A Portrait of Life in Modern India. It's a book about development and new prosperity in India, and also the dislocation and disruption that often accompanies development. Many of the chapters are set in rural India, including the chapter from which I'm going to be reading now. It's set in a village called Molasur in Tamil Nadu. And the chapter revolves around a character called Sati, who is a landlord or zamindar. He's a very fascinating character because he's grown up with a tremendous sense of entitlement, and privilege going back generations, and now as modernity and development are creeping into the village, he's having to deal with that loss of privilege and that sense of entitlement, and as you will see, he feels very ambivalent about it. So the scene is set on a monsoon afternoon as I go for a walk with Sati through the village and through his fields around the village. I loved going for walks in the fields around Molasur. Sati and I would start in the village, on narrow lanes lined with thatch huts and tile-roofed houses. The lanes felt crowded. More than 5,000 people lived in Molasur. We'd pass by a sandy children's playground, and then an ancient temple, its turret blackened by the years, that stood at the edge of Sati's land. The land was wide open. It was always exhilarating, like a breath, to step from the congested village into the open fields. Sati carried a bamboo stick whenever we walked. He swung it in big back-and-forth motions, up and down, sometimes passing it horizontally between his hands. He said the stick was to protect us against jackals, but I never saw any jackals. I thought the stick was a way of asserting his authority. There was a grey afternoon in November, an interlude between monsoon showers, when Sati said he wanted to show me something on his land. He said we would be going farther than he had ever taken me before, past the fields, past the reservoir to what he called his forest land. It was almost 100 acres of wild, uncultivated property. He said it had been used in the old days by the Britishers to hunt for rabbits and pheasants. We began outside his house. As we passed through Molasur's winding streets, people ran up to greet Sati, many of them with folded hands, some of them bowing a little. Sati was paternalistic. He inquired after their education or health. He asked how their jobs were going. He chided one man who worked in Chennai, reminding home to send money home for his ailing father. He scolded another who had been without a job for several months. It was late afternoon as we walked through the fields. The sun was low. It had just emerged from grey clouds into a narrow band of blue stretched over the horizon. It was a gentle, blurry winter sun. It hung like a butterball over the land. Sati talked, kind of babbled as we walked. He seemed preoccupied. He had just returned from a trip to Bangalore. One of his wife's relatives, an uncle who had made a fortune in real estate, had given a party to celebrate the purchase of a large property. He had invited 6,000 guests. They were served a lavish meal with hundreds of dishes and live music for entertainment. After the party, Sati's son asked him if they could give feasts like that too. Sati said, I told him, never, never. Don't expect these kinds of extravagances from me. I'm just a farmer. I can't rise to that level, but I get good respect. Everyone knows who I am, and I can give you a good life. That's all you can expect from me. People are so superficial in this country nowadays, Sati said. All they care about is showing off. I go to Bangalore and it's full of all these IT workers. All these young kids with their cell phones and money and all that, they've become like Americans. They have wallets full of credit cards and pseudo feelings. You meet them and they say hi, and then they say bye. They might even say they love you, but there's no real feeling. It's just like America. We want everything big and quick. Don't get me wrong, he went on, I'm happy for my people. I want them to develop. I want them to get rich. Development is good for them. It's educating them, making them more confident. People stand up for themselves, even the women, they're so bold. My mother never dared to raise her voice with my father, but look at what my wife does to me. I said, you sound like you're contradicting yourself. He said, no, I'm not contradicting. I know it's good for the country. I know things have to change. They should change. Some people rise and others have to fall. My family was high for so long. I know my status can't stay the same forever, but still, the ego is there. The ego clings to what it had. He told me that some nights, lying in bed, he woke up thinking about how different life in Molasur had become. He thought of the farms that were turning fallow and of the old country road running by the village that was becoming a highway. He knew things would change even more. He figured he had about 5 years before the village became unrecognizable. His kids would never live in Molasur. They would never be farmers. He would have to sell the land. He woke up in the middle of the night, and the knowledge of all this change, of a way of life he'd never share with his children, would seize him. He'd feel a tightness in his chest. He would think of how his father had died, and the tightness frightened him. He would sit outside his room on the veranda. He took deep breaths. The village would be quiet, the lights off. It was something like the way it used to be, before everyone got motorcycles and televisions and electricity, and the silence would calm him, give him strength. At moments like that, he felt he could handle anything. We have to learn to let go, Akash, Sati said, swinging his stick as we walked through the fields. We have to learn to accept it. It is difficult, of course, but we have to accept. Sati's forest land wasn't really a forest at all. It was, in fact, quite barren. Sati said it had once been covered with mango, neem, and palmyra trees. Now all that remained was a thin line of palmyras, their trunks encased in an ancient carapace of spikes, their leaves rustling in the monsoon wind. The forest had been cut down, chopped away one branch at a time by villagers foraging for firewood. It had been reduced to a flat, if wild and beautiful, stretch of shrubs and thorn bushes. We lost control of the land, Sati said. Before, no one dared to cut on our property. But when our status went down, I couldn't manage things as well as my father. I couldn't stop the villagers around here from killing our forests. My legs were tired from the walk. I crouched on the ground on the slippery grey clay above a stream. The stream flowed fast. The rains had been heavy. It was a successful monsoon. Quite a downpour, I said to Sati, and he agreed, and he said it was good for the farmers. But then he shook his head and said it was nothing compared to some of the rains he remembered. He remembered standing on this land in the pouring rain, his face flat in the gusting wind with his father when he was a boy. They had come to inspect a dam that existed back then. The rains had been ferocious, the strongest that he had ever seen. The dam was in danger of breaching. The village could have been flooded. Sati's father gathered more than 500 men. He called, and they came, and they worked in the rain, strengthening the dam with bags of sand and logs from cashew trees. They worked for 3 days. They saved the village. Sati told me that story, and he told me how proud he had felt of his father. He had so much control, so much charisma, he said. Everybody obeyed him. Sometimes I wish I could imitate him, but I don't have his looks, and I don't have his charisma. Do you think that the village would have stayed the same if your father was still alive? I asked him. No, I wouldn't say that, Sati said. That's going too far. Even my father couldn't stop modernity. Even he couldn't block what's happening in this country now. Sometimes, to tell you the truth, I think it's good he died. He wouldn't want to see everything that has happened. He told me a story about a meeting that took place in the village near the end of his father's life. The meeting was held outdoors under a banyan tree. His father was late. Everyone stood up when he arrived. Everyone, except for one man, a Dalit youth named Raju. Raju had spent some time working in the cities. He had fancy, modern ideas. He was defying the Rediyar. Sati said his father's face turned to stone when he saw Raju sitting. He didn't say anything at the meeting, though, and he didn't say much the rest of the day. He was silent at dinner. Later, when Sati was massaging his father's feet in the bedroom he shared with his parents, his father looked straight at him and said, "I don't know how you will manage. I don't know how you will cope." Now, Sati told me, when he visited places like Bangalore and Chennai, when he saw what was going on in the cities, he wondered if maybe his father was right. "Sometimes I think that maybe I goofed up my life," he said. "Why did I stay a farmer? It's silly to be a farmer these days. We landlords missed the Industrial Revolution, and now we're missing the technology revolution. Maybe my father had a point. We didn't know how to cope." He didn't say anything for a while after that. The land, too, was silent. We felt far away from the village, far from the road that was becoming a highway, and farther still from the cities that would be connected by that highway. Dragonflies hovered above the stream. A group of myna birds dug at the ground. A kingfisher exploded in a burst of blue. Sitting there, the stream gurgling below me, the chirp of crickets in the air, and a mongoose pawing nervously at a clump of wild berries, searching maybe for prey, I could just about remember the way my rural home had felt so many years ago when I was a boy. Sati's forest land felt untouched. I felt alone, which in India, with its crowds and commotion and constant churning, was something to cherish. "I love this land," Sati said. "It's that old feeling, something that hasn't been lost."
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid to say that we haven't got time for questions, as the Vinod Mehta Lucknow Boy session has been moved to this tent. So we have another session starting now. But please, we will all be doing a signing now. You can ask your questions after you've bought our books, and we will be happy to answer anything you want to answer. So please, a big round of applause for the Seven Drummers.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you.